In 1991, this worn leather-bound journal with the first few pages torn out found its way into the possession of a scrap metal dealer in Liverpool in northwest England. Now, what this journal reported to be caused quite a media storm and a publishing storm when it was published into a book, because this unassuming journal claimed to be the diary of Jack the Ripper. Hello and welcome to a new Detective Squirrel Investigates video, where we will, of course, be looking at the Diary of Jack the Ripper and, of course, the publication of this book, which I happen to have a copy of. And as it says on the cover, we will be also looking into the discovery, the investigation and the authentication of the journal. Now, we'll start at the beginning with the discovery. Scrap metal merchant Mike Barrett of Liverpool came into possession of the journal in 1991. Now, according to Mike, when he was drinking in his local, the Saddle Inn, he met an old man by the name of Tony Deveraux. Tony was a retired print worker and they became friends. Mike would often visit Tony's home, touch and bring food, and just be a generally good neighbour. And then one day when he visited Tony, Tony gave him this package. He said, "You've been really good to me, Mike, and I want you to have this and just do something with it." Mike took the actual package home, and when he opened it, discovered the journal within. He was disturbed when reading it because of the graphic details it went into of the murders of the canonical victims of Jack the Ripper. And in fact, at the end of the journal, it's even signed, "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." Now that may sound familiar. This was supposed to be written in 1889. But during the time of the actual Ripper murders, there was a number of letters that the police and others involved in the investigation received, including this quite famous letter which starts, "Dear Boss," and finishes, "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." Now, the problem being that for a long time, before 1991 and the discovery of this journal, this letter was considered to be a fake and was considered to have been written by a journalist at the time of the murders. So not only had this journal, the discovery of this journal and the actual question of if it's legitimacy, but also questioned the legitimacy of that letter. Even at the time, or a couple of years after the murders, Commissioner Anderson claimed that in his belief, it was written by a journalist. So it was believed to be written by a journalist for a long time. But if the diary could be actually proved to be authentic, then perhaps that letter, which was believed to actually have been fake for so long, perhaps that was indeed written by the Ripper as well. So who wrote this book? Well, it's based on initials given by the writer and names of wife and children. It's believed to be a certain James Maybrick. Now, James Maybrick was a successful cotton merchant in Liverpool, and he was also a drug addict. But it was viewed differently at the time because his drugs of choice were arsenic and strychnine, which today are considered poisons, but at the time were freely available from chemists. But even then, chemists had to actually keep strict records of when these doses were collected. And so the chemist where James Maybrick collected his medication from has documentation of when he came in to actually collect his medication. None of those dates match with the Ripper victims. So there's nothing to say he wasn't in London at the time of those murders. And then you get the details in the records, in the journal, the details of the murder scene, which some believe only the killer could actually have. James Maybrick lived in a house which was called Battle Crease in Liverpool, with his wife and their children. Well, they didn't actually own the whole house. It was discovered later that they only rented an apartment in the house. When the publishers and the writer of the book actually first announced it, and talking about James Maybrick, they suggested that he was a successful cotton merchant who owned Battle Crease House, but that wasn't actually the case. He and his wife actually rented rooms there. Now, by the time of the late 80s, early 90s, just before, around the time that the journal was supposedly discovered, before it came into the possession of Mike Barrett, the actual owner of the Battle Crease house at that time was having it renovated, and it said that carpenters who were working in the room that was James Maybrick's office when they actually resided there were taking up the floorboards and discovered the journal under the floorboards. And I mentioned about the details of the murders in the diary and how some of the details could only have been known by the killer. In particular, the murder of Catherine Eddowes. Now, after her body was discovered, one of the police officers there wrote a list of her belongings that were with her body. Now, one of these items was a tin box, an empty tin box. Now, why should that be significant? Well, that document of the list of items was lost in the Scotland Yard archives for 100 years. And it wasn't until 1987 that that document was rediscovered. So only the killer could have actually known of the items on that list. And in the diary it states for describing the actual, after the description of Catherine Eddowes' murder, going through her belongings and stating, "Damn, the tin box was empty," which suggests that only the killer could know about the tin box, as it was almost 100 years before that document was found and nobody else knew about it until 1987. So if the diary was to be a fake, it would have had to actually have been written in 1987, when that document, and not long after that document was discovered, or in 1988. Tests were carried out on the paper. The tests determined that the paper was authentic Victorian paper. The ink was tested, and again was actually confirmed from the makeup of the ink to be an authentic Victorian ink. Then tests were done under an electron microscope to actually determine when the ink went onto the paper. Now, according to the publishers, the test proved it was from the right period. Slightly upset about the announcement of this, the scientist in Manchester University who carried out those tests also went to the press afterwards and actually said what his findings actually found was that the ink most likely went onto the paper in or around 1921. But even that date is, maybe a dozen years either side. So it could be as early as 1909 or as late as 1933. So it's quite a big range there. But as far as the actual believers and those trying to authenticate the book, particularly the writer and the publishers, that was enough. Because if that's accurate, then it's well before the date, the 1987 date. So only the killer could have actually known that information about Catherine Eddowes' tin box. Then, just before the actual publication of the book, another find came to light. A gold watch, a Victorian gold watch, which had scratches inside the actual case. Those scratches could be made out to actually be the signature of James Maybrick and the initials of the Ripper victims. Then the other piece of evidence that they actually suggested, his description of certain scenes in the actual diary. Another interesting detail that's in the diary is describing what happened after the double event, and particularly the Catherine Eddowes murder in Mitre Square. Now, it's believed that after killing Catherine Eddowes, the killer left Mitre Square and headed to Goulston Street. This is where famously a piece of Catherine Eddowes' apron was discovered, the killer having used it to actually wipe his blade clean. And also in the doorway where it was left was discovered some graffiti written in chalk, which famously said, "The Jews are not the men to be blamed for nothing." Now, previous to this date in the diary, the writer of the diary states about the newspapers claiming that the killer is a Jew, and how humorous he found that, the fact that they were nowhere near close to actually finding him, and the fact that so he states in the diary, "If they want me to be a Jew I will be," and claims ownership of the writing there. And a report written by a police officer at the time claims that not only was it not spelt Juwes, as often is reported, but was spelt correctly Jews, and that in his opinion it must have been written by the killer. More evidence to actually suggest the authenticity of the diary. Then there was another final piece, his magnus opus, if you will, the murder of Mary Jane Kelly. Now, at the scene, which I will warn anyone of an uneasy disposition or anything who does not want to actually see this, I am going to show the actual photograph from the murder scene of Mary Jane Kelly. Now, as anybody knows, the murder of Mary Jane Kelly was the most gruesome of them all. But believers in the diary claim there's something else, and the writer of the diary actually claimed as well, claimed that they'd written in blood initials on the wall. It's claimed by the writer of the diary and those who believe in the authenticity of the diary that those initials are FM. And who is FM? FM is Florence Maybrick, James Maybrick's wife. According to the diary, the reason he started these murders was because of his wife's infidelity. He couldn't murder her because it would be too obvious that he was the killer. And having visited the Whitechapel district of Liverpool, that gave him the idea of travelling to London and killing prostitutes in the Whitechapel in London. And that would actually feed his anger and his fervent need to actually kill. And at the final murder scene, apparently he wrote the actual initials FM to indicate that it was him killing his wife in the only way he could. Interesting, some years later, when Maybrick died after getting to the stage where his drug abuse was far too much and the damage from the arsenic and the strychnine had become pretty much terminal, he was in so much abject pain that he took a double dose, and after a few days that double dose ended up killing him. But because Florence was actually American and a woman, the law was against her. She was actually convicted and tried for the murder of her husband. The murder claim being that she had actually poisoned him, although there was no evidence to actually suggest such a thing, and the fact that he admitted to actually having taken that double dose. It still wasn't enough. The judge who presided on that case actually, one day, in summing up, was supporting Florence. And there was reports to actually suggest that evening he was overheard pacing in his chambers, muttering to himself, "She did it, she did it, she killed him." And the next day his summing up was completely different, very actually almost verbally violent towards Florence, and she was convicted, and she was due to be hanged, but after a large letter campaign in support of Florence, that was commuted, so she wasn't going to be hung. And indeed, 15 years later she was released from prison. So it does seem to be a lot of evidence to actually suggest that this is authentic. But now let's look into parts of the investigation and the results of such investigations that the publishers and the writer chose to ignore. First of all, let's go back to Battle Creek's house and the renovations and the claim that the carpenters taking the floorboards up in Maybrick's study discovered the journal. According to the carpenters, that's not actually true at all. They took up the floorboards, but there was nothing underneath them. But the actual authentic Victorian paper and the authentic Victorian ink. Well, I mean, anybody in the know can actually get authentic Victorian paper. Could have actually found an authentic Victorian journal and wrote into it. Perhaps the actual pages that were torn out the front was what was originally in the journal, those pages torn out, and then the actual false Jack the Ripper's diary written into it. The ink is in the same way. Could quite have actually easily have been anybody who knew the actual right ingredients could have recreated authentic Victorian ink. The scientist who actually claimed that the actual date was what the ink went onto the paper was most likely 1921 or a dozen years either side. He also said that even in that test, the dates are even the date of 1921 and a dozen of years either side is 60% at best, possibly even only 50-50. So there isn't a test to actually prove when the ink went onto the paper. What about the brass watch that was discovered? Well, I mean, again, the publishers actually paid scientists to actually look under an electron microscope and found tiny microscopic fragments of rusted brass in the scratches, suggesting that it could have only actually been, the scratches could have only been made a long time ago. Couldn't be precise on dates. The owner of the watch also had his own tools, one of which was actually a brass engraving tool, which was known to actually become rusted at the end, at the tip. So it's quite possible that that brass rust was from the tool he used to actually fake those engravings. Then the handwriting was actually of the diary was checked against other pieces, including the aforementioned Dear Boss letter. Handwriting wasn't a match. There was a postcard that was sent sometime after, which was believed to be the same handwriting and the same journalist who wrote it as the Dear Boss letter. The handwriting on the postcard matches that on the letter, doesn't match the journal. And there was another letter, the letter that famously starts "From Hell." The handwriting from this letter was checked against the handwriting in the diary, also not a match. The only actually piece of handwriting which is believed to actually have been that of James Maybrick was his will. The handwriting from the will doesn't match the handwriting in the diary. Now, the writer and the publishers claim that there is a story suggesting that James Maybrick's brother went to him on his deathbed to actually have him actually, create and put together a new will, and suggest that it's actually his brother's handwriting and only his signature. But that doesn't explain it. Now, basically based on actually paperwork from the time and journals and Florence Maybrick's actually own diary, it suggested that the affair that she had, which led to him going on to this murderous rampage, didn't actually happen until it didn't happen until 1891. 2 years after the diary was written, it was supposed to be written. And 3 years after the murders. Now, according to the publishers and the writer, they found evidence to actually show that it was actually 1887 that this affair took place. Odd that Florence would actually have a completely different date in her diary. Then we come to the what could potentially be the biggest hurdle, the tin box, the mention of the tin box. Now, it's suggested that only the killer could have known that, because the piece of paper that the list that had been written by a police officer was lost for nearly 100 years and wasn't discovered again until 1987. And if the diary dates before then, it proves it must be the killer. But does it? That policeman could have easily told somebody else, some other police officer, or somebody at the office where the paperwork actually went to, could have seen that list, could have actually told somebody else, and by word of mouth that could have led to actually other people. So it doesn't prove at all that it has to be the killer. And I showed you the image of Mary Jane Kelly's murder scene, and the close-up of what's supposed to be FM on the wall. Could you see it? So there does certainly seem to be more evidence against the authenticity of the diary than actually proving that it is real. But as you know, this is the Detective Squirrel Investigates channel, and it's not. I just presented the information, the data that's available. It's up to you to decide if in your opinion the diary is authentic or not. So thank you for joining me again, and in the meantime, this is Detective Squirrel out.